I finally got around to installing a second Schneider inverter. It is now paralleled with the first one, so we have twice the power output for powering the house and garage off-grid. This is just in time for the winter of 2023 and 24. Last year, I kind of noticed that I needed the extra power output in the wintertime, and now we have it. If you want to see how I wired up the second inverter, as well as programming it, stick around. Hi everyone, I'm David and I'm on a mission to take my house and garage off-grid. For the last year, I've been using one inverter to power the house and garage. Most of the time, that's fine, but there have been 2 times where I popped the 250 amp circuit breaker feeding that inverter. So I overloaded the system. And that's where I wanted to get a second inverter paralleled in. Now that happened last winter when I was running both heaters in the garage and the house, along with probably had an oven or something kick on at the same time, and that overloaded the inverter or the system and it popped the circuit breaker. Now I've finished installing a second inverter, and you can install up to 3 inverters on one power distribution panel, PDP. Or if you are running multiple PDPs, you can install up to 4 on a single phase or even more on a 3-phase system. Each of these inverters has a toroidal transformer built in, which gives you 120 and 240 volt split phase power right out of a single inverter. So you can add inverters in oddball increments. There is no other inverter that I've tested that does a better job on surges and load imbalancing between lines. These are really phenomenal inverters when it comes to the power, the efficiency, the surge capacity. They're great. That's not to say that they're not without their issues. It certainly took a lot of time to run all the wiring, hang the second inverter, the wiring, and then it did take a while to figure out all the nuances with programming it. So we'll talk about that. The inverter comes with a steel wall hanging bracket that you screw to the wall. And it actually locks in with the one next to it, so they'll be in line with each other, and they can share support on a single stud. If you have studs 16 inches on center, the backing plates work out perfectly. My studs happen to be 24 inches on center, so I threw in a few extra 1/4 inch hardware. I used 1/4 inch lag screws and flat washers, and I screwed it through the cement backing board into the OSB and where I could into the stud behind it. According to the manual, the inverters are to be hung on a non-combustible surface. So I have a piece of tile backer board. It's a cement board that I mounted on top of the oriented strand board and wood studs of my garage. Once the wall hanging bracket is attached and can support the weight of this thing, ask a buddy for help. Each inverter weighs 122 pounds. That's 55.5 kilograms. So when you go to hang this, make sure you have a friend for help. In my case, thanks Dad for giving me a hand to lift this up. And once you get it on there, it just hooks on that wall bracket and can hang there and wait until you get it situated. I actually added a couple of shims behind it because the inverter wants to tilt towards the wall at the bottom. I wish that Schneider would add a couple little standoffs behind there, just like they did on this PDP. The PDP came with a couple of plastic standoffs in the bottom 2 corners that keep the PDP plumb. The top is secured with a couple of number 10 screws that come with it. That keeps it from, like if you hit this thing, it's not going to bounce off and come off that bracket. After the inverter is mounted and secured, you could certainly make all your own wiring. But I bought Schneider's expansion kit for 2 or 3 inverters off of the PDP. That gives you this nice wireway. It's metal wireway. It's all UL approved. It's going to pass inspection very easily. But it also comes with the wires pre-labeled, the lugs pre-crimped on there. It makes for a nice quick installation, at least quicker than making up all of your own wiring. That kit is called the Connex Inverter Connection Kit, and here's the part number for it. And it comes with the wires, it comes with the wireway, it comes with the plastic bushings, not only for going to the inverter to the wireway, but also it comes with a smaller plastic bushing for the Cat5 communication wireway, which is a separate connection in the back so that the inverters can all talk to each other. Now that was nice that they included that, because when you buy the PDP is this large unit and it comes with one wireway. But Schneider does not include that smaller, I think it's a 3/4 inch plastic bushing in this kit. But they do include the plastic bushing when you buy the inverter connection kit. I actually wish that Schneider would include that extra bushing on the PDP as well. So it came with 4-aught wire. Now remember, this is a 6.8 kilowatt inverter. So a lot of times when you look at 6.8 kilowatt inverters, they're going to suggest something smaller, maybe a 1-aught or a 2-aught wire. But in this case, Schneider knows that the surge capacity on this is so great. We're talking 12 kilowatts per inverter, that they don't cheap out. They give you really good 4-aught wire to go from the bus bar to the inverter. So that's really nice on their part. The AC load wires, the alternating current wires, they're all number 6 gauge. They got crimped on wire ferrules, and they go from the terminal box here over to the PDP. And those are also flexible UL listed wires with that ferrule. They're nice setup. They're all labeled. Now you're gonna have 2 sets of hot wires. One of them is for inverter out to the load panel. The other one is labeled as grid input to the inverter. Now in my case, I'm running this completely off grid. I'm not connecting the grid to it at all. So I actually ran those to the generator terminals on the inverter, and that's how I'm going to be using them. Is if I need to run the generator, I can run the generator connected to the inverters, or I can bypass it as well. In addition to the connection kit, you also have the option of buying some additional circuit breakers. So let me show you the circuit breakers over here. There's additional circuit breakers and this cool plate. So if we turn this off, we can slide the plate back and forth, and that allows for bypass mode. So if anything goes wrong with the inverters and you need to wait for a part to get repaired, you can run the grid, or in my case, the generator, directly to your loads by running it in bypass mode. So this bypass plate keeps you from accidentally having both on at the same time. So the plate and the extra inverters, they come in an additional box. It's an extra part number. And so that part number is up here on the screen. So that's the extra breaker kit. As I was installing all the wiring, I hand tightened everything. Then I went through with a torque screwdriver and torqued them all to spec. The specs are printed everywhere. They're on stickers on the back of the PDP. The torques are printed on the circuit breakers. They're in the manual, so there's no trouble finding that. But I went through and made sure that everything was torqued to spec. So then I went through and I zip tied everything in place, and I ran my Cat 5 communication wires. So I actually ran all my communication wires at this step, which I probably should have waited. So I'll get to that in a sec. But there's a ZAN bus communication network, as well as when you parallel inverters, there's another Cat 5 cable for syncing them up. So I ran all my data communication cables. They connect up the inverters, the charge controller, and they go down to this device called the Insight Home. The Insight Home gives you your Wi-Fi. It allows you to change all the settings on the inverters. So once all the hardware is done, now it's time to program things. And this is where I probably should have waited on that data cable. I needed to program this inverter, but it was in fault mode because it wasn't set up right. So what I did was I disconnected the communication cables. I ran from the Insight Home directly to this one inverter, and that way I could change all the settings in this inverter, get it all correct before paralleling. So I didn't realize that there might be another way that Schneider has to do it, but I struggled with that a little bit because I had them all communicating and it was in fault mode. So once I changed it, so just the Insight Home was talking to just this one inverter, it was not in fault, and then I could update the firmware in it. So it was one firmware revision behind what this inverter was. So I still had this inverter's firmware on my computer, which is nice. You don't need the internet in order to set this up. That's something that I really appreciate that Schneider did. You can download the firmware in advance and then upload it to this at the job site. Then I was able to update the grid code on this to the same thing as this inverter, and I was updating the date and time code. Once those were updated, then I could finally reconnect all the communication wires, the ZAN bus and the sync wires between the two, and now I could set them up to work in parallel. So one needs to be set up as the master, which is right here, and the second one needs to be set up as the slave unit. Now you need to make sure that they're labeled as split phase master, split phase slave, because there's also an option for single phase and three phase. These are running in split phase orientation, which is North America standard 120/240. Now the last thing to set for getting this inverter to turn on, because this whole time this inverter's been in fault mode, is you have to set a device number. And for some reason I missed it. It is printed in the manual, but you have to put everything into standby mode in order to change the device numbers. And I think maybe I was just putting this one inverter in standby mode, but I still had the other one in operation. But basically I had to set this one to device number 1 and this inverter to device number 2, so the master and the slave. And now they finally work. They finally are sharing the load. And that was such a relief when I got to that point. So I started throwing on switches and sharing the load, and it was great. But I did notice something that needed a little fine tuning. So I'm switching on loads, and the inverters are working, they're sharing the load, and I'm running the house off grid, and I'm thinking everything's great. But I kept playing with it, and I noticed something that was just a little bit odd that I could fine tune. And that was when there was no load on these. They were both on, but no load, so they're in idle. I had one inverter, I think it was this one, that was like pulling extra wattage from the battery, and this one that was drawing the extra wattage and like charging the battery. So this one was inverting and this one was charging. So there was about a 100-watt loop going on here between them. So there is a calibration that you can do, and it used to be that you needed an extra tool, but Schneider, when they went and updated to the Insight Home, they got rid of the need for that extra tool. So I'm going to give you the cliff notes on calibrating these inverters. Basically, they both need to be on, but the circuit breakers up here need to be off. So they're not actually tied together. I then use a multimeter and I check the voltage right at the output terminals on both. And I noticed that they were just slightly off. It was like 0.8 volts off from each other. And that was actually verified with the Insight Home. So the Insight Home was reading accurately as to what the voltage was. And so I checked that with my multimeter. So by going into the Insight Home, so that means going to a computer, opening up the Insight Home on a computer, you then go to the advanced settings and it's AC output calibration. Now this is a 32,000 number. It was like 32,700 or something. So by adjusting that 32,000 number up or down, we can actually adjust the output of the voltage slightly. And so the goal is to get them to output the exact same voltage. And so I brought them both up, and now they're outputting the exact same voltage. Then when I turned on the circuit breakers again with no load, I went back and looked at the Insight Home, and now they're sharing the load evenly. There's no hidden loop of 100 watts. So they were both doing what they were supposed to do. It looked great. They idle at a very low wattage. These inverters are really excellent for their tear loss. I think each inverter draws 34 watts in idle, but these are 6.8 kilowatt inverters with a 12,000 watt surge capacity each. So having 34 watts of a tear loss of idle, that is really, really good. So in conclusion, let's look back at what this took. It was about 2.5 days for me to do this project, which sounds like a long time. I wasn't out here the whole time, just like 8 hours a day. It's little bits and pieces, probably 6 or 8 hours if you just worked nonstop through the process. And that is certainly longer than it would take to set up an all-in-one inverter, something like the EG4 PV, the 18K PV inverter. That's a great all-in-one inverter. So if you're looking for a really simple, fast installation, that would be a good one to go with. But it's not going to hold a candle to the surge capacity and the line imbalance capacity that these have. I mean, these are really powerful. Nothing else I've ever tested comes close to the power handling ability of the Schneider inverters. Let me know if you'd like to see a video in the future of pushing the surge limits of the two paralleled. I already have a good video pushing the surge limits of one inverter, but I could set up some experiments running the two in parallel if you guys want to see it. I've been running the house and garage now for about a week with the two paralleled, and they've been working great. I haven't had any more hiccups. I'm going to continue pushing this all winter long. Hopefully we don't have any issues. I don't foresee any, but as always, I will let you know if there's some problems. And now I'm going to be turning my attention to setting up my charge controllers. I've just been experimenting with this one so far, but in the future I'm going to be setting up some more. So thank you everybody so much for watching. If you enjoy these videos, please like, subscribe, comment, and share.